You got a single plane on your LS? What's better, one of these or one of these? As usual, there's a dyno test involved. In this video, I'm going to compare carburation to fuel injection on the same Holley single plane intake. So since the intake is set up for a carburetor, does carburation have the advantage? What if I told you that intake was also set up for port injection? So does fuel injection have the advantage? Let's throw another curveball in there. I'm going to tune all the cylinders individually with the fuel injection to optimize the power output of each cylinder. So now who has the advantage? Carburation or fuel injection? Now our test motor was actually a very famous one. By now everyone should have heard of the Big Bang 6-liter. This is the same stock bottom end LY6 that we made 1,543 horsepower at 29 pounds of boost. We ran a pair of Borg S75 turbos and I turned it all the way up until I ran out of map sensor. That's right, I topped out our 3-bar map sensor and we could only make 1,543 horsepower with that stock bottom end. But that motor is still alive and I used it for a ton of testing. And I used it for this test. But for this test, I equipped it with a set of stock 706 heads with a valve spring upgrade. Now the reason I needed the valve spring upgrade is because we installed a camshaft in this. We installed the Summit Stage 3 turbo cam. Now that Summit cam featured a 600/575 lift split, a 231/234 degree duration split, and a 115 degree lobe separation angle. Now I can already hear the comments, but go ahead and make them. Why did you put that cam in an NA test when you're running a single plane manifold? Did I use the wrong cam? Did I use the wrong cam for the single plane? Did I use the wrong cam because it's NA and it should be a turbo cam, should not be a turbo cam? Let me know in the comments what you think. But the reality is, no matter what cam I use, the difference between carburation and the fuel injection would be exactly the same. So here's an important point. Not only did I compare carburation versus fuel injection, but I also compared individual cylinder tuning on the EFI. So when I go in and nitpick and change the air-fuel ratio of every cylinder, how much power is it worth? Well, we're going to find out. So we got a lot of stuff to get to. Let's get to the results, and we're going to start with a little class on tuning. Before we take a look at our comparison between carburation and fuel injection on that single plane intake on our 6-liter, I've got a little quiz for you. Let me bring up 3 air-fuel ratio curves for our fuel injected LS. Look at that. I know a lot of tuners out there are going to say, hey, that's pretty jaggedy, why can't you make it perfectly straight? The reality is that that's only a variation of 0.3 of an airfield point, so it's just a scale. But that's not my point here. Let's take a look at this. So we got this one, and we got our middle ground. So we have 3 runs, all fuel injected. And what I did was add fuel and take away fuel from this middle position, the one in red. Now if we take a look at this, we see a variation air-fuel ratio of 1 full air-fuel ratio point. So we got a high of 13.0 down to a low of 12.0. So now my question is, which one of these makes the most power? A lot of tuner guys out there are going to say, hey, you got to run these LS motors at 13.0. Every LS makes best power at 13.0. Let me know in the comments. What do you guys think? Which one of these makes the most power? Do you have to run it at 13.0? Does it want to run down at 12.0? Does it want to run somewhere in the middle? Let me know in the comments. Also, pick which one of these you think makes the most power. And also, tell me what the difference in power is. Like which one of these makes the most, which one of them makes the least, but which one of them do you think, what's the difference between the most and the least? What's the difference in power here? Because I'm trying to show something that we're going to learn and we're going to take a look at later on. We're definitely going to use this information later on in our discussion on carburetors versus computers. But which one of these makes the most power and which one makes the least, and what's the difference? Now remember, our question was which one of these makes the most power, which one makes the least, and which one do you think, what's the difference between those two? What's the biggest power difference? Well, let's take a look. So we got a change in air-fuel ratio of 1 full air-fuel point. Now let's find out what the difference in power is. So let's look at the same 3 runs. Oh, grab that one twice. So there we go. I'm going to get rid of this down here so that we have a better look. Get rid of our fuel flow. Look at that. That's the difference between our 3 runs, a full air fuel point. The biggest difference we're seeing is a change of 4 horsepower. So by changing the air-fuel ratio, 1 full air-fuel point, we were only able to change the power output by 4 horsepower. And on this particular motor that makes over 475 horsepower, that's a variation of less than 1%. So look at that. When we change the air-fuel ratio 1 full point, we change the power by less than 1%. So keep that in mind when we're talking later in our difference between carburation and fuel injection, because we're going to see differences in air-fuel ratio, and a lot of guys are going to say, hey, that's why it made less power, that's why it made more power. But the reality is that even if it's a full air-fuel point difference, that was only 4 horsepower. So keep that in mind. Now let's take a look at carburation versus fuel injection. I want to apologize for not finding the run videos. I have thousands and thousands, and when I go back and try to do some of these older tests, this was run back in like September of 2019. I have to search through all these videos to try to find them, and sometimes they look the same, they're hard to find. So but I didn't want to stop that from bringing you guys this information, because this is really good stuff. So we'll have to get to it, and if I can post them later on, I'll try to do that. Now let's get to the power outputs, the differences between carburation and fuel injection run on the same 6-liter LY6. Let's start off with the carburetor. So this is the power curve produced by, we ran both a 750 Ultra XP carburetor and an 850. And the reason that I tried both carburetors is because we had a 1000 CFM throttle body that we ran, and I didn't want people complaining that the power output change is only because one of them had a bigger throttle opening. The reality is that the 750 was more than big enough to feed this 475 or 80 horsepower, and the 850 showed no gain, so no additional airflow. It didn't change anything. So really this motor wasn't using all of the 750, and it certainly wasn't using all of the 1000 CFM throttle body that we put on the fuel injected combination. So this is the power curve generated by the carburetor. Now let's take a look at our power curve generated by the throttle body and injection. Look at that. So we have a little bit less power and this is run in batch fire, not sequential. So it's important to note that, because we're also going to run this in sequential. So this is with batch fire. We made a little bit better power out at the top with the EFI, but less power than the carburation through most of the curve. Now let's take a look and see why that is. We'll take a look at the air-fuel ratio curves of these two runs, then we'll get into sequential injection. After taking a look at the difference in power between the carbureted version and the fuel-injected version run in batch fire, let's take a look at the air-fuel ratio. So that's from the carbureted combination. And this is our batch fire EFI port injection. As you can see, we can make the curve nice and flat as we want. We can have it be the same all the way across, which is something the carburetor wasn't able to do. It started out very lean on the load-in, 13.2, and kind of got progressively richer. There was a little jump here at 5,700, but it ended up down at 12.2 from 13.2 to 12.2. But remember, we saw the change of 1 full air-fuel point, at least with the fuel injection, didn't show a substantial difference in power. Remember, it was only 3 or 4 horsepower. So the difference in power between carburation and the fuel injection in this case probably has more to do with the change in temperature, the charge cooling offered by the carburetor compared to the fuel injection. Now that we've taken a look at this, let's take a look at the difference between batch fire and sequential injection when we're able to go in and individually tune all of the cylinders to optimize them and maximize the power output of each cylinder. Now that we've demonstrated the difference in power between carburation and fuel injection and the difference in air fuel, let's take a look at what happened when we went from batch fire, which is this, to full sequential, meaning we went in, adjusted the cylinders individually, and optimized the air-fuel ratio of each cylinder. So we'll go to our sequential run. You see, we were able to tune a little bit more power into it. Not a lot. See our differences there. 448 versus 452. So again, that's like 4 foot-pounds. It's actually a little bit more down here where we had a bigger change. That was 11 foot-pounds. So that was a good gain. But all in all, I mean, the shape of the curve is the same. The power output is about the same. And we were able to get a little bit more. But what I want to do is I want to go in and I'm going to show you what the difference in air fuel was. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select 2 of the cylinders, because you'll find out that we have about the same average air fuel, but what we did was lean a couple of cylinders out, richen a couple of cylinders up, so that everybody else met in the middle. So let's take a look at that now. What we're going to take a look at now are, I'm going to select 2 of the cylinders. We ran individual O2s in all of the cylinders, and I want to take a look at, I'm going to isolate just 2 because it's a lot easier to show you. Otherwise, it gets really busy looking at all of these graphs with all 8 cylinders for 2 different runs. So I'm selecting cylinders 1 and 8. This is with the batch fire. See, as you can see, we had a big disparity. Over 14 to 1 in cylinder number 1, and as rich as 11.4 to 1 in cylinder number 8. Obviously, these 2 need to be adjusted. So let me show you what happened when we went in and ran this as a sequential system and went in and tuned these individually. So if we overlay this, this is our sequential run. See, we can do whatever we want to the air fuel curve. If we go in and tune it and we want it to be 13.0 or 12.8 or 12.7, whatever the number is, we can make it do exactly what we want. So what we did was take these more than 14 to 1, down below 11.5 to 1, and brought them together. And this still produces the same average air fuel. So if you were to take an air fuel reading in the collector like we normally do, you'd see the same air fuel ratio. It would have the same average air fuel, but you wouldn't have this big disparity. You wouldn't have one that's so lean that it might burn something down, and one that's a lot richer than you'd want it to be. So by doing true sequential, you can go in, tune each individual cylinder, and show what we have here, where they're grouped together, they're the same, they're both safe, they're both making power, and as we saw, we were able to pick up a little bit of power, not a ton, but some. But the big point is, this is now much safer, because you don't want to run at wide open throttle at over 14 to 1 air fuel ratio. Our final comparison is between the carburetor and the EFI with sequential fuel injection after we did all of the tuning. So this is the carbureted run, and this is our double wazoo individual cylinder tune sequential fuel injection. And as you can see, the carburetor still made more power down low and in the middle right above 5,000, but as we saw before, the sequential fuel injection and even the batch fire made a little bit more power at the top. And I think that that's because in the carbureted application, it actually started to get a little too rich with the carburetor and didn't make quite as much power on the top. And the problem is, if we take a look, we can go quickly over to our air fuel curves there. See, the carburetor was a lot richer down here out at the top where it made less power. Now the problem is, we could adjust that. We could jet it, we could do air bleeds, we could do high-speed air bleeds, we could do all the cool stuff. But the problem is, when you make a change in air fuel with a carburetor, it's very difficult to make it at one specific spot, one specific RPM and load point, without it affecting everywhere else in the curve. If you make a jet change, it's going to change the air fuel ratio everywhere. So if we lean this out at 6,500, it's going to lean it out more than we would want it down at 3,500, because it would start getting dangerously lean down there. And that's one of the limitations of a carburetor. I know guys are going to say, hey, yeah, do high-speed air bleeds, it will just adjust it there. But it doesn't do that. I've never seen that work that way, and we've run carburetors and tuned them on the dyno for the last 25 years, and I've yet to see somebody come in and be able to make an air fuel ratio change with a carburetor at a specific RPM point. So if you can and you're out there, let me know in the comments if you can do it.
please come over to Westech and show us how, because it would be the first time that I've ever seen that. That's just one of the limitations of the carburetor. Otherwise, this stuff works well. It made good power. Now let's get to our conclusion.
Okay guys, what did we learn in our comparison between carburation and fuel injection on that single plane intake? Well, the first thing is, and this usually surprises a lot of people, carburetors make good power, and there's a reason for that. It's usually because of charge cooling. You see, air enters the carburetor, it's perched on top of the manifold, so there's time to cool that air all the way through the manifold, into the head port, and then into the combustion chamber. Now, port fuel injection doesn't allow that same amount of time, but carburation is limited. On port fuel injection, we can dial in the air fuel at any RPM, any load point, and you just can't do that with a carburetor. But port fuel injection doesn't allow charge cooling like the carburetor does. So they both do great things. Now, even if we go in and fine tune the air fuel ratio of every cylinder, the gains just aren't that great, at least not in terms of power. But they are great in terms of safety. If you're driving around at wide open throttle with one cylinder at 14:1, something bad's definitely going to happen. So if you go in and tune that cylinder, maybe you don't get a bunch of power, but you'll keep your motor. I'm Richard Holder, guys. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. Make sure to comment, what did you think? Carburetor's going to win? Fuel injection's going to win? Is there room for both? Let me know. Thanks for watching.